So we begin with our session number 36. We are on chapter 14, as I already said, the Gospel of Mark. Last Sunday and the Sunday before that, we have been dwelling on the institution of the Eucharist. So just a quick recap, okay? We know that the institution of the Lord's Supper, it was basically Jesus had instituted the Eucharist over the fourth cup of Thanksgiving. Remember, 4 cups used to be part of the Passover Savior. And after that fourth cup, blessing the fourth cup, that was the time he has instituted the Eucharist as an everlasting covenant for all of us. Soon after the blessing and the institution of the Eucharist and the completion of the Passover meal, we have Mark telling us that they began to sing Psalm 118. Probably Psalm 118 doesn't mention that, but they sang a song. Okay, and we know that it must have been part of the Hallel. Those were the Psalms from 113 to 118. Those were the Psalms that were constantly sung and recited by all the pilgrims who used to congregate in Jerusalem in huge numbers. So wherever you went, okay, when it was the eve of the Passover and on the Passover night particularly, the air would reverberate with the sound of Psalm 118. Blessed is the name of the Lord. Okay? Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. So this was, a constant strain that would fall on the ears of all who would be participating in the Passover. So Passover, as we have seen, oftentimes I have repeated, it was one of the most major of the three pilgrimage festivals that the Jews took part in. So after the singing of Psalm 118, Jesus then, we will see, he will go to the Mount of Olivet. The Eucharist we have done as a little recap we are doing about what we have done last Sunday. It is the new manner of the new Passover, of the new Exodus, and we have seen how these connections are drawn and how it was so very necessary for Jesus to institute the Eucharist as a new manner, because that was what was promised before the coming of the Messiah. So we have also seen finally Jesus is going to be the Paschal Lamb about to be offered as full and final sacrifice. With this, now we shall move forward. We have seen the Eucharist. Now we will be going further with the narrative, how Jesus then goes to Gethsemane and then forward to the Passion narrative. But before that, just a brief sort of introduction to you to know, like when people came to the Passover, how the sacrificial cult was practiced in the Temple of Jerusalem. Just in few quick slides, I will run you through what used to be the feel of the Feast of Passover, because until and unless we go to the depth of that, we will not understand the meaning of Calvary and thereafter resurrection. So imagine, like, you are one of the pilgrims who have come. Maybe you've come from Galilee, or you've come from one of the Judean villages on the periphery of Jerusalem, and you have come over there. So it was but natural that people would come together in bands, in huge groups, and it used to be a camp-like atmosphere. People would be camping out, along the mountain sides, because not everybody would find residence in Jerusalem. So when the people would come, they would always, when it was Passover, each of them, minimum 10 people were required to eat of the Paschal Lamb. So when people came, they normally would be coming bearing the sacrificial animal, the sheep, the goat, whatever. So a member of a group would generally start the fire in the oven. Then you see here, these are all part of a huge group. So the temple was a huge complex we have seen, and especially the plaza was very, very enlarged by King Herod. So thousands and thousands of people could be accommodated at a time. Okay, so the sacrificial cult would be in full swing, especially on Passover day. So it is like if you are part of a group of say around, you've come from the village, and some 2 or 3 families have all come together. So there are a group of around 15 to 18 people. So not everybody will go along with the sacrificial animal. There used to be small furnaces, so they would make ready for the Paschal lamb to be roasted, because they would do it all here, and then they would take it either to their camp or to their lodgings wherever they were there. So a member of a group would generally start the fire in the oven so that they could begin roasting their lamb the minute they got back from the courtyard of the priest, because this was a place, the courtyard of the priest, where the lamb, the Paschal lamb, would be sacrificed. And when the people generally came, this in fact I've already shared with you, but I will be repeating again. People came in huge numbers and they would pass along the pilgrimage way, which was on the south side of the temple. So huge bands of people, coming in pilgrimage. So when they came, when they reached the temple, this was the welcome that used to be given to them by the Levites and the priests. Along the steps of the temple, they would, play their trumpets and greet the people, my brothers, you're from so and so place, they would say, okay, welcome unto you. And this used to be the festive atmosphere all around. When they would go, when they neared the temple was a huge place, as I told you. When they were nearing the holy sanctuary, which would actually be the place of the sacrifice, it was very imperative for them that they had to take off their shoes. They couldn't enter inside the holy sanctum with shoes on. And generally the entry would be along the Hulda gate. It was called the double gate. So from here people would enter. Okay, so when they entered the Hulda gate, they would go round, towards the east side, because this was their tradition, because the entry would be from the northern side. So when they entered the Hulda gate, they would enter from here. They would inside, they would climb up, and they would find themselves coming on that huge esplanade, the plaza. And from there, they had to turn towards the north. They would head towards the north. So this was normal practice for the pilgrims when they assembled in Jerusalem for Passover. These were the main four gates, to the northern courtyard. It was from here they would all enter. They would all line up. There would be huge queues, And from here the gates would open, close. The Levites and the priests would take, the groups of people. So when one group was taken in, the door would be shut. The lambs would be sacrificed. All the details they would run through, and then they would let in the next group. So these were the four main northern gates, the courtyard. From there they would enter. And this, can you remember? We have seen this earlier. This was the Soreim. This is the place where beyond this Gentiles could not enter. It was strictly forbidden. So till here, everybody was welcome to come. But beyond this, Gentiles, under pain of death only, they could cross. This is the Soreim. That is it. Everywhere there would be crowd out. Here. This is a pictorial illustration artist, making a representation. So at one or two places only it would have been inscribed. So before them stood the Soreim, the low fence beyond which only Jews who have been purified by the ashes of the red heifer could go. Now this red heifer was, I have not dwelled with you right now, because it's a huge elaborate ritual that would be carried out, wherein a huge red color heifer would be burned and the ashes would be used to purify all the people who would be entering the temple. And this used to proceed many days prior to Passover. So before they entered the precincts of the Holy Temple, they had to purify themselves with the ashes of the red heifer. Nothing else would do. Before entering in, there used to be a sort of, a pedestal on which they would go and kneel, and they would kneel on the special stone that was designed for this purpose, and this was supposed to be a gesture of humility and thanks to God. And then they would proceed inside. The priest would close the courtyard gates to prevent more groups from entering. So when one group was in, the doors would be closed, the ritual would be carried out inside, because this was a huge exercise. It is not like only your families from your village you have assembled, you will be given all the attention. So simultaneously, many sacrificial animals, paschal lambs used to be sacrificed, because this was an ongoing thing, because huge people, huge numbers of people congregate. So you can very well imagine what must have been the scale and the extent of this sacrificial cult. From late evening, afternoon, they would start and it would go on. This is also another picture. The pilgrims approach the courtyard with their offering, and all are hurrying to get started. So this is the unblemished lamb without blemish. Only those animals who we have gone through this earlier. There used to be a very elaborate ritual by which there shouldn't be a single blemish for the sacrificial animal. And this used to be actually very big business, and we have seen how Jesus, took great offense to all this, because he felt that this was very, very exploitative on the part of the Jerusalem priesthood. But whatever, during Passover, this was the ritual that was strictly followed by all the pilgrims from whatever part of the world they were sent with. All the while that the men were entering the courtyard from all the 4 northern gates with their sacrificial offerings, the Levites stood on their platform and sounded blast from their shofars. Now, what are shofars? Ram's horn, they would use, that sound they would make with the silver trumpets and the shofars. It would reverberate across the valley and could be heard in a very great distance. Also, lots of villages and all could hear this. So, this was a festive atmosphere. A song of great solemnity was attached to the celebration of Passover. And the Levitical choirs were very, very famous for the beautiful temple music that they created. Even to this day, if any of you ever get a chance, you can go to YouTube and just check out Levitical choir. You can actually listen to the music that used to be played in the second temple during the time of Jesus. The richness of that, because these are the practices that ultimately they poured into the early church, and even now we have elaborate choirs and all that mass and all that. From where has all that come? These were the predecessors from whom we have borrowed our cultural heritage, the religious heritage. The Levitical choir included singers and musicians who played on trumpets, harps, lyres, and cymbals. They sang the festive Hallel songs of thanksgiving. Everyone who had entered with their Passover offering also joined in and sang along. So it was, and with the accompaniment of music, the entire sacrificial ritual would be carried out. So it was a moment of great solemnity, and especially for people who gathered from across the villages, from the rural areas. When they would come and watch this, they used to be carried by the fervor of the moment. So this was something that added on to their very cherished and treasured memories. The offering, when the lamb was brought, the first thing would be tied over here, and they had to put their hands on the lamb, so that all the sin of the person who is the offerer of the sacrificial animal, all the sin will be transferred onto the animal. So that used to be the thing, and then only the ritual slaughter of the lamb would take place. After the lamb was slaughtered, have you seen this rows of how the people are sitting with their sacrificial animals? And alongside, parallel here, you have rows and rows of priests. Okay? And this is happening at through all the 4 gates of the northern gate. So here, when the lamb was slaughtered, they would slaughter it, with that Chetya method, by which there would be minimum paying for the animals. So they were very particular about practicing all this, which is very much practiced till today by the Jews and the Muslims as well. So when the animal was slaughtered, there used to be a net at the neck of the animal. The blood would be gathered here in a temple vessel which was called the Mizrah. So all the blood would be collected in the Mizrah, and have you seen when this animal's blood has been poured into this, he will pass it on to the next Kohen or to the priest. he will in turn pass it on, and this would go on here, that whole line, till finally with that temple, that vessel with the collected blood of the animal would reach the main altar. This is the altar where the blood had to be poured, and certain parts of the animal's body had to be burned here on the altar. So the priest formed a line so that once the blood was drained into the Mizrach, they could pass it from one to another all the way up to the altar. So this is the way the blood would reach the altar with a temple vessel. People watched as the priest climbed up the altar carrying pieces of people's offerings to be roasted on the altar fire. The blood used to be carried in that Mizrach, and it would be poured on the four corners, that is the horns of the altar. Okay, but besides that, people are standing, and what are they watching? Certain parts of the animal's body, and what in particular would they be? The fat, in particular, the fat of the animal was entirely an offering to God. Okay, the blood and the fat from all the internal organs. Sometimes in certain cases it would also be the tail of the animal, because that was considered to be a cherished part of the animal. So people watched various parts of the animals are being carried here in this basin, and here on that huge fire all the parts of the animal would be burned, because that would be an offering to God, okay, a pleasant aroma to God. So the priest of the golden climbed to the top of the altar and threw the parts that were forbidden to eat into the altar fire. So there were certain parts, like the fat of the animal, could not be consumed by the sacrificer at all, neither also by the priest. Similarly, the blood would be poured at the base of the altar. So this is the Mizrach what is having, and the animal parts are brought here. Certain parts of the animal would also be reserved as portions for the priest. In particular, the kidneys could not be carried away by the sacrificer. It was a special portion that was kept for the priest along with the hinds of the animal. So depending on what kind of sacrifice it was, the parts of the animal would be distributed. The fat, particularly the fat around the internal organs and the tail in some sacrificial types, was considered the choicest part of the animal, and it was seen as a symbol of the best that the sacrificer had to offer to God, and that is why it was burned on the altar as a pleasing aroma to God. And this is a practice which was not only specific to the Jewish people. This was the religious tradition of all the people of the Levant, all the people of Mesopotamia in the ancient cultures also. Wherever animal sacrifices were carried out for their gods, these were the main principles on which it was carried out. And the blood was, we are all aware, the blood was understood to be the life force of the animal, and was therefore reserved for God. And that is why that complete taboo of not, eating meat which has not been, sacrificed in the way it is supposed to be. Okay, so animal meat containing blood on it was considered to be serious taboo among the Jews, and so the religions that followed from them. So the blood would not be, there was a complete prohibition in the consumption of blood, because blood meant the life of the animal. So it had to be poured in offering to God on the altar as a symbolic offering. And after that was done, they would, hang the, you must have seen this also with sometimes the butcher's market also, this is a sort of common sight. But in the temple also there used to be, special hooks along marble pillars, where the animal's carcass would be, after all the blood was drained out, the carcass would be skinned, the skins would be set aside, and the animal would be given to the sacrificer. While the blood and fat was specifically meant for God, so nobody could lay claim to that, the meat of the animal was normally shared between the sacrificer and the priest. When this was done, you can imagine thousands and thousands of lambs being slaughtered in one sweep of an evening, the amount of blood that used to be drained, and all that blood used to be drained down the Kidron Valley, which we will see when Jesus crosses over to go to Gethsemane. So when the slaughtering, okay, the Passover offering was over, the slaughtering was complete, the priest would need to wash down the courtyard with water. So can you see the amount of work that the priest had to do? So they were like, sort of literally all-rounders. They were good at minting coins, they were good at slaughtering animals, good at skinning the carcasses. So it entailed a huge amount of work on the part of the priest, and that is the reason there were contingents of them. Every week there would be one group that would be serving the temple in rotation, the next one would take over. After the skinning of the carcass and whatever portion was meant for the priest was given to him, the animal was returned to the people. Okay, so they would go and roast it on the spits that were all there along the courtyard, and they would carve out the lamb and then go home and have the Passover Seder. So families began the Seder the moment the Seder was, that elaborate Passover meal. It is called a Seder because there was a particular order that they would, follow in the liturgy of it, which is called the Haggadah, which we have seen earlier in the previous sessions. Everyone made certain to sit on soft pillows and lean to their left only. Like we have seen how when Jesus also had his Last Supper, we had shared the pictures of something called the triclinium, okay, that three-sided couches on which they would, the middle portion, the pit was left free, and from there they would reach out to the food that would be served. That was supposed to be the hallmark of a free man, not a slave, and that is why it was mandatory for them to lean only to their left and have their meal. So can you see, all of them are taking part in the Seder. The 4 questions, the normal questions, the youngest one would ask, why is this night so very different? Because otherwise we eat boiled, cooked meat, okay, but why only the lamb has to be roasted and it cannot be cooked any other way? So this is normally part of the 4 questions the youngest in the family would ask, and the eldest in the family would go about explaining to them why this night of the Passover was so very important. Because remember, what was Passover? It was a commemoration of the Exodus, and the people would go into the memory of their ancestors to relive that experience, like as if God is coming again to save him. So they were actually celebrating the mighty acts of God's liberation. So whenever they marked Passover, it was not only like they were remembering, but actually participating and entering into the experience of their ancestors. So this is the way they would go forward. And then it would end by the singing of the Hallel, that is the Psalms from 113 to 118. This was, the Hallel would be everywhere that you go in, whatever nooks and corners, whatever lanes you would traverse. This was common to, have the songs falling on your ears that used to be sung at the top of the voices. So before midnight, the family had to finish the meal because they could not, keep anything for the next day. No part of the lamb and all could be kept. Everything had to be finished. So before midnight, the family finished their meal and blessed God, and then they would go to the rooftop. If they were Jerusalemites, they would go to their own rooftops. People who were living in the tents, whatever, wherever they were, and at the top of their voice, they would sing out in all, glory, the Hallel, glorifying God's mercy and His mighty acts in delivering them as a people. So this was common sight in Jerusalem. Now on this night, when Jesus has already instituted the Eucharist, his heart is very heavy. Everywhere the songs of the Hallel songs can be heard. Everybody is, even some of them maybe even beyond midnight, they are going outside. It was a very festive atmosphere for the people. So they, it was a time like maybe sometimes many of them met, like some families after many, many years. So it was a place of, mutual interaction, gathering, kindling old connections. So it was a sort of a very great festive atmosphere all over, and the people were in a very joyous, mood celebrating the Passover. But look at Jesus. Jesus also has, taken part in the Passover Seder. And he is now on his way to go to the Mount of Olives with a heavy heart. We come back now. We will read first the chapter 14 of Mark from verse 26 onwards. Peter's denial foretold. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, Peter must have been very astonished, and so too also the other disciples. And he said to him, "Even though all become deserters, everybody may forsake you, I will never do that. I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, Peter, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." But he said vehemently, we know how Peter's character, a very impulsive man, but a man with a very great heart. So he had great love for Jesus, and no doubt, he must have truly meant what he really said. But as Jesus later on will say, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And vehemently he says, even though I must die for you, I will not deny you. And all of them said the same. So when Peter said this, even the other disciples, they said the same thing. We can, let us go into that moment and just imagine Jesus literally drops a sort of a bomb that all of you are going to desert me, you will forsake me, because it is written in the scriptures, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. What is Jesus quoting over here? He is obviously quoting Psalms. And Psalms are one thing that is oft quoted by Jesus besides the prophets that he constantly quotes. So here he is saying, okay, he knows what is coming. They have no idea. Okay? They have no idea even when Jesus, without any similes or metaphors, he makes a direct reference, point blank, he tells them what is coming. Even then, most of the as Mark calls them, the 12, the disciples just failed to see what this man was actually talking. And even on this particular night, which is going to be the most memorable, unforgettable, Jesus has already made a prediction which is sadly going to come true within few hours. So Jesus has instituted the Eucharist over the fourth cup. He has sang the Psalm probably 180, and they have now moved to the Mount Olivet, which is supposed to be his favorite place of refuge. We are into the last part of chapter 14 with this. Something profoundly sad is in the air that unforgettable night. Jesus prays in the language of Psalms, as we have seen here. I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. These are to be his final words to his disciples in the gospel. Okay? Of course, later on in Gethsemane, we will see now, he comes back trying to wake them up, but as a sort of an interaction and a dialogue which he was constantly used to having with his disciples, all the hours that he invested in forming them, the formative years, the formation hours, those things, those are the final thing. The curtain is drawn now here. And they go to the Mount of Olives. Jesus often traveled over the Mount of Olives on the 40-minute walk from the temple to Bethany. Remember, in Bethany, he had some of his best friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And it was at their house he often, dined, must have also, taken rest. So whenever he went to Bethany, he definitely had to go across the Mount of Olives. And not only when going to Bethany, even otherwise, this was a place that he frequented, because this was a place that offered him solitude and also a lot of solace. Jesus, though he spent so many hours in his ministry, performing so many miracles, spending time forming his disciples, teaching the people, he never lost sight of prayer. So he always sought out places of solitude, and Mount of Olives was one such place which offered him that consolation. Coming to the Mount of Olives, it is to the east of Jerusalem, and it is the location of many biblical events. It is a place, okay, of great symbolism in scripture, rising to more than 800 meters. When you convert it to feet, it is 3,000 feet. It offers an unrivaled vista of the old city and its environments. So when you stand here along the slopes of Mount Olives, the Mount of Olives, you can literally see the whole city laid out before your eyes. The hill is also called Mount Olivet and takes its name from the fact that it was once covered with olive trees. Today, when you go to modern Jerusalem, there is a church of all nations, and only adjacent to that you have the olive grove. But otherwise, during the time of Jesus, okay, the entire hillside was covered with olive trees. Today, you have lots of houses all over. Until the destruction of the temple, which took place in 70 AD, the Mount of Olives was a place where many Jews would sleep out under the olive trees during times of pilgrimage. So this night also, when Jesus is going to the Mount of Olives, it is likely that lots of people were camping out there on the slopes of the mountain, because that was normal sight. As I told you, it was not possible for all the people who were converging from the diaspora to find lodgings in the city, in the heart of the city, in Jerusalem proper. So they would put up tents, and Mount of Olives used to be their favorite spot. And even after the temple was destroyed, and during the siege also of the temple in AD 70, the Roman soldiers from the 10th Legion, remember, 10th Legion was called Praetorians, they used to camp out over here. They were staying over here. And later on, after the temple fell, also 2 legions were around the temple and also possibly around this place. Interestingly, this is also a place, okay, where you will find Jerusalem's main cemeteries with an estimated 150,000 graves. Can you see this? This is all along Mount Olivet, on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. And why is that so? Why the Jewish graves are all over here, and more than 150,000 graves is a huge number of graves right from the time of Jesus and earlier. Why? There was a reason behind it, because in Jewish tradition, the Messiah would descend from the Mount of Olives on Judgment Day and enter Jerusalem through the Golden Gate. One of the gates of the temple was called the Golden Gate. It was also called the Gate of Mercy, or the Beautiful Gate, which today is blocked. Okay, that double gate in the center of the eastern wall of the Temple Mount, it is blocked till today. And because the Jews, they believed that when the Messiah came, okay, when the Messiah came, there would also obviously be the resurrection of the dead. That was a Jewish belief. So they, whenever anybody died, they would always express the hope that they should be buried over here, with the hope that when the Messiah comes, they would be amongst the first to be resurrected. So according to Jewish tradition, their hope is to be the first resurrected when the Messiah arrives and walks through the east gate. This is a prophecy we find in the book of Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 1 to 33, and that is why we have this big graves. So when Jesus is going, okay, we are not sure whether 150,000 graves were there at that point of time, but definitely many of the graves were there when Jesus was passing. So it is a place, okay, which only spells of death all around. To come to this also, to go to the Mount of Olives from the Temple Mount, he had to cross the Kidron Valley. When crossing the Kidron Valley also, you will see immense flows of blood from the sacrificial animals that were slaughtered in the temple. So it is basically a place, okay, which speaks about death. Among these tombs, okay, the Jews also believed earlier there were graves of the prophets Haggai, Zechariah and Malachi, who lived in the 6th and the 5th centuries BC. But that is, their belief, because today archaeologists and all, they are certain that these tombs don't belong to that era. 6th and 5th century BC means 600 and 500 years before Christ. Okay, so definitely the graves are of a later date, but that was a belief of the people that these prophets also were buried there on Mount Olivet. This is the Golden Gate that I told you on the eastern side, which Suleiman the Magnificent, okay, the Ottoman Sultan, he ordered it sealed in 1541. That is recent, as 500 years ago. But the double gate. And what was the reason he did it? Because he, in simple words, he wanted to see that this prophecy of the Christians and the Jewish people would not come true. So the Golden Gate on the east wall of the Temple Mount dates back to ancient times. This is a very ancient gate, not even during the time of Jesus, but much before that, during the time probably of Solomon, a little later than that. But obviously during the first temple period, this gate was definitely there. And the belief among the Jewish people and also the Christians to a certain extent that the Messiah, when Jesus comes, okay, the second coming of Jesus is definitely going to come from the eastern gate. This is also a prophecy in the New Testament. So the rebuilt eastern gate of Jerusalem, okay, was the main entrance during the first temple and the second temple, and this probably is a place through which Jesus entered on a humble donkey on Palm Sunday. Remember, this is now sealed in 1541 onwards, but prior to that it used to be open, and from here the pilgrims would all enter, and from here they would go across the pilgrimage road right up to the Temple Mount. Between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives is the Kidron Valley, which flowed with the blood of sacrificed animals. And Jesus must have seen this as he was crossing it to go to the site of Gethsemane. And on the hillside, you must have seen these Jewish graves. So it is an entire atmosphere of impending doom for him. Imagine he's entering into a phase where he's going to have an intense struggle at Gethsemane, and seeing all these things are making him even more apprehensive of the moment that is fast approaching. At almost 3,000 feet high, with a spectacular view of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives has witnessed a lot of history. This was a place of rich symbolism for the entire Jewish community, for the Jewish people, and later on for the early Christians also, because this was a historic site where David, when he was fleeing from his son revolted against him and took over the throne by force. So when David was fleeing Absalom, this was the place he sought refuge. Similarly, Mount of Olives is also supposed to be the place where Solomon made altars to false gods, and that is why the prophets come heavily condemning what Solomon was doing. We hear about this in the book of Kings. Similarly, King Josiah, later on 200 years later, when the discovery of that scroll in the temple was made, which was supposed to be the scroll of the book of Deuteronomy, and with that he initiated a great reform, because people at that point of time, around between 700 and 600 BC, people were sort of drawn away to idol worship. They were easily sort of tempted to go into all this type of idolatrous practices. And King Josiah, when he introduces that reform, he smashed the sacred stones and tore down the Asherah poles, which were a very common sight here on Mount Olives. And Prophet Zechariah, also the others, they are supposed to be buried on the Mount of Olives. Now this is the place also we know that Jesus entered into Jerusalem to the shouts of Hosanna. Now the Garden of Gethsemane, I wouldn't like to call it the Garden of Gethsemane, but this site of Gethsemane is on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives. Today, the garden is fenced off to protect the ancient olive trees that are at least 1,000 years old. Despite being where Jesus traveled to many times, this is the place we Christians should remember, that this was a place of solitude and consolation and solace that Jesus sought out, and especially on the last day of his life. But it is not so much for that Gethsemane is remembered, but this Mount of Olives is more renowned today. Why? Because that is supposed to be the spot from where Jesus is supposed to have ascended into heaven, which we read in the book of Acts. Now, coming to this place, okay, there is a lot of debate about the exact age of these olive trees, whatever, these are all. But many of them, even the archaeologists and people who normally specialize in all this, biology of trees and all, they also say that these trees are probably more than 1,000 years old. So whatever, they must have been, silent witnesses to the troubles that Jesus went through. And whatever, whether he was here at this place, because that is disputed, that Jesus went through the agony in the garden, in the so-called Garden of Gethsemane, or some other place, which we will be, I will be bringing out in the next slides, whatever the disputed place. But we can be absolutely sure that this was definitely the place, that Jesus frequented, passed through over here in order to get to the site of Gethsemane, which is a little, in fact, away from this place. This is another picture. From Byzantine times, the mount became a place of church building, and by the 6th century, it had 24 churches surrounded by monasteries containing large numbers of monks and nuns. So this is the view, okay, of the Mount of Olives. Coming now to Gethsemane. Jesus prays in Gethsemane. This is the full text I put out of Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. 10 verses. Let us read through and break it down. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, have you noticed? Mark does not say that they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. What does he say? They went to a place called Gethsemane, or Gethsemane as it was called, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came again a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. This is the full text I put it out for you for your quick reference. Let us break this down, okay, in parts. The first few verses. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. I am deeply grieved, even to death. He is directly saying these words. He has taken the disciples. It is not only the 3 core disciples along with him. All of them are there along with him. And he says this, and yet this does not register with the disciples. This is something very, very inexplicable. How is it they could not sense the agony and the turmoil that was going on in the heart and mind of Jesus? It's something, it's very, surprising. It looks like as if their minds were completely sort of, blurred. The hearts were, free of, feeling any emotion. And they were blinded with their eyes to see that they could not see the amount of grief that Jesus was literally going through when he makes this desperate cry of, appeal for help. And what type of help? All that he wants is, he wants their companionship. He wants them around him, and they are not able to. And going a little further, He threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, what you want. Let us see this. To give you an overview, he is asking his closest disciples to stay with him, literally imploring, my heart is grieved to death. He uses these words. Imagine if you were there and Jesus had to say this to you. How would you not be deeply troubled if you really were of one mind and heart with him? But that did not happen with the disciples. He is asking his closest disciples to stay with him and to be ready, but they are not ready and are taken by surprise when the cohort of soldiers, temple guards come in to arrest him. I'm giving you a full overview. I will break it down further. Jesus is arrested and taken into custody, which we will see later, and they all end up fleeing except Peter. Peter, who had said, remember his bravado, I will never forsake you. Okay, he said that you will all desert me. Okay, they will strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Peter says, no, even to the point of death, I will never leave you. Okay, Peter, who had said, I will never forsake you, never deny you, but to Peter's credit, at least this much we can say, that the others, at the very first signal, they abandon Jesus. But at least Peter follows Jesus part of the way. But all the same, he ends up denying Jesus anyways, because when they reach the courtyard, and when he is, recognized by one of the servants of the high priest, he is so scared, he just ends up, denying Jesus royally, saying that he has nothing to do with the man. But whatever, at least from this, we can make out that they all ran away, but at least from a distance, Peter was following him. And towards the end, we will have the contrast between the high priest asking Jesus who he is, after which Jesus confesses even under pain of death. We will be seeing in the later episode of the Passion narrative, where during the Jewish trial, when Jesus is brought before the high priest, the high priest asked him after, many questions put to him. They couldn't find, ultimately something that they could pin him down with. And finally, the high priest asked him the question, are you the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus, even at the pain of death, he knew if he had to confess his true identity, death would follow. But even under pain of death, Jesus did not deny his true identity. And what does he say? I am he. But Peter, on the other hand, looked at him, accused of being Jesus' disciple, outright denies that he is Jesus' disciple. So see the contrast Mark brings out. Mark brings out this contrast between the characters, the story that is unraveling here, unfolding here, wherein clearly Mark wants to show us that Jesus is going to be alone in his way to the crucifixion and finally to his death. The scene picks up with Jesus praying in Gethsemane, which is one of the most vulnerable moments of Jesus' life. He prays, my soul is deeply grieved even to the point of death. And this again is the language of Psalms. This shows us, we have seen n number of episodes in the Gospel of Mark and even in the other Gospels of the New Testament. Jesus is frequently quoting the Psalms. He must have been, completely immersed. Language of the Psalms had become his own language of expressing love and adoration to his Heavenly Father. And the Psalms often speak, if we look at most of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. And in many Psalms, sometimes the psalmist is giving vent to the deepest, the darkest feelings also that go into his mind and heart. And often it is the psalmist is suffering, and is suffering for what? Not for his own fault. He is the righteous sufferer. Though he is innocent, He's suffering and he's calling out to God, where are you? Why don't you hear? Why don't you hear my pain? Why don't you heed my pain? Why do you not hear my supplication? So the Psalms often speak of a righteous sufferer, like in Psalm 41. The righteous sufferer is betrayed at table, just like Judas. Lots of parallels. So Jesus is, drawing from this rich minds of the Psalms, because this has become his way of, life, a way of constant prayer, of being in constant intimacy with his Father. Similarly, we will see on the cross how he is praying Psalm 22, that he will pray, and he will end with Psalm 69, expressing that hope that finally all the suffering that he is undergoing, it will have a triumphant end. So these are the Psalms of the righteous sufferer who says, God, what have I done and why am I suffering like this? When will you deliver me? The same thing is here, okay? This running into the mind of Jesus. This is the agony, and through the Psalms, he gives expression to his great anguish and misery that he is undergoing. Jesus is the righteous sufferer par excellence. So he has more right than anyone to pray the Psalms. In fact, if we really look, he is the only true righteous sufferer of the Psalms, which was a great prayer book for the Jewish people and continues to be a great prayer book for all Christians too. It is a legacy that we have inherited from Judaism, but the flow, the songs, okay, of great pain and suffering that the psalmist gives voice to is, we find a very strong echo of it in Jesus, especially at prayer here at the site of Gethsemane on this night when he will be arrested. As we go through the Gethsemane account, Jesus uses the word Abba to address his Father. He says, Abba, Father. Have you seen this? This seems significant because Paul too is going to mention this. He picks this up, okay? Twice in his letter to the Romans and the Galatians, okay, Paul mentions this, okay, Abba, Father, just like how Jesus, addressed his heavenly Father with whom he enjoyed such deep intimacy. And the church picks on this and has become the heritage of the church. Now, why did Jesus use this expression? Was it common to use Abba amongst the Jewish people? Is it something that Jesus, it was very specific to him, something very unique to him? Looks to be, because when the Jewish people prayed, of course, Abba was a very common, personal title for one's father. But using it in prayer was something very unusual. Whenever the people prayed, okay, they would not take the name of God because it was considered to be extremely holy. They would, refer to God with his generic name, Hashem. Okay, but here Jesus is calling God his Father, Abba, Father. So what does it show? It illuminates the deep intimacy he had with his heavenly Father. And many scholars, even till today, they debate, because later on in rabbinic literature, we do find that some of the sages, okay, after the fall of the temple and all, they try to bring about some parallels. But Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, okay, early church fathers, Bishop of Lyons, he insisted that it was unique the way Jesus addressed his Father, unlike no one ever. He says, okay, he very beautifully defends it. It was no doubt a common title used, okay, a tender way of addressing one's Father. But in prayer, this was something very unique that only Jesus used it for the very first time. We do not know how really true this is, but at least we have not come across any ancient literature of the Jewish people where, God was addressed as Abba, Father. So it indicated, especially at this moment of intense agony that Jesus is undergoing at Gethsemane, it indicated profound intimacy and tenderness between Jesus and his Father. We see Jesus' relationship with his Father throughout the Gospel, and we are going to witness this in great depth at this particular moment. During his ministry, Jesus often would, you remember in Mark's earlier episode, when his family came to see him from Nazareth, they walked many miles and they must have come there to Capernaum. And Jesus was at his normal best, he was teaching the people, and they suddenly seemed to crash in. And somebody comes and tells him, your brothers, your sisters, and your mother has come. And what does Jesus say? Who is my brother, my sister, and my mother? Okay, all those who do the will of my Father in heaven, these are my brothers and my sisters and my mother. It is not blood ties that is going to define, okay, what is your family. It is going to be the relationship that you have with God the Father and with Jesus finally. If you do the will of God, that is what defines you and gives you a unique place in the family of God. So here Jesus very, emphatically said that it is only those who do the will of my Father in heaven, they are the ones who I'll consider my family. This night, his will be tested beyond human limits. He is speaking to his Abba, and he is going to do the will of his Father no matter what, but he pleads for solace all the same. He is determined, he will do the will of the Father, but he is at the same time a human being, and probably the only human being who knew probably exactly how he was going to die. Okay, we can it is very safe to surmise that, given the prophetic knowledge that Jesus had about himself, about the impending crucifixion and death, okay, what kind of death, horrific death that he would die on the cross, definitely Jesus knew, okay, what would be the pain and the depth of it all. And imagine any other person, any human who would have such a knowledge. Suppose if I had to know that tomorrow I'm going to die, maybe in an accident, I think the very moment I've got this knowledge, I would cease to exist, because that fear and the trauma of it was enough to kill me. So here also Jesus, despite knowing the entire weight that is bearing down on his soul, is still able to say his yes to his Father here at Gethsemane this night. Amongst all of us humans, Jesus is the one most intimate and closest to the Heavenly Father. And at Gethsemane, it is this filial bond that father and son bond, that is going to be tested beyond human comprehension. Because what happened here, the deep psychological, struggle that Jesus went through, it is very difficult for us human beings to really comprehend the full depth of it. Maybe this, you could make some other way. Maybe the world could be saved without my dying. It is like as if Jesus is, Mark doesn't tell us everything, but we can just imagine ourselves what must have been going, that poignancy, that Jesus is actually not even feeling the presence of his Father. That comforting presence also is gone, because what is going to happen at the cross is anticipated here at Gethsemane. We shouldn't forget that. And that is why when Jesus is asking his Father, can there not be another way? Maybe the world could be saved without my dying. So see the intense struggle, okay, that is going on in his happy life. But what is God's answer? God's answer is no. That's not my will. Because that was the only way the world could be saved. And Jesus is willing to do it because it is his Father's will. He gives it, okay? Because he knows, and God remains silent, his answer is no. There is no other way. Because this is the only way, okay, that the righteousness of God can cover you and me and all of us. To Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Just imagine Jesus himself is undergoing intense struggle, but he still has a care for Peter. He knows, he has already predicted that that Peter is going to deny him, and his prophecy we know will come true. And here he thinks about Peter, okay? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial, that you may not be tested. And Luke, adds something very beautiful, okay? And when you have been, when you have come around, strengthen your brothers too. the other synoptics don't add this. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same thing. So Jesus is going in, coming out, going in, coming out. He's there at the same side. Disciples are fast asleep. Okay, they have already gone into the seventh heaven, but here the Lord is struggling with deep emotions. Okay, you can very well see, okay, the full extent of this. He goes to his disciples, but they keep falling asleep. And we see Mark tells us 3 times. Even Matthew and Luke also tells us the same thing. So 3 times he went back and forth, back and forth. Now, why is it pivotal that they stay awake? Will these people, has Jesus ever asked them anything at all in their lives? Okay, never anything in particular that we can remember. But at this moment, it is looking for companionship, for consolation, only of their human presence, and even that is denied him. Jesus goes to them 3 times. He had already said in chapter 13, watch and pray. But this is the one night and the one time he needed their comforting presence around him, but they failed him as usual, what was expected. Now, an important detail that we should not forget about this night. We must remember that this is Passover night, and Passover being a nocturnal festival. Why do we call it a nocturnal festival? Because it would begin only after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would go way up till midnight. So it was more or less a sort of a night festival, ending by midnight. So people are used to staying up late, celebrating the acts of God's redemption. But not this Passover. This Passover, the disciples are heavy with sleep. Don't you think that, now, even the disciples used to have a good time during Passover. They would, break out in vibrant celebration. It is very, very strange that on this particular night of the Passover, when the whole world out there in Jerusalem and around is celebrating, the disciples are heavy with sleep. It looks like as if, Jesus is deprived even of the slightest human consolation as companionship. Okay, appears even the heavens conspired to deny Jesus this small measure of comfort. It's very, very strange. Why did this happen? Because normally they all would have had a good as well. And Paul trying to connect the dots regarding the impending gloom in this would come. The one time that the Lord needed them most, he asked them to do something with him. They are our spiritual predecessors. Okay, they failed him, and this is the same Lord who went to the cross for us. And when they offered him a painkiller on the cross, remember Jesus was offered wine vinegar, okay, before he breathed his last, but he refused to drink that. And what was that wine vinegar? It was a painkiller in order to deaden his pain, but he refused to take it. Why? Because he had come to bear our pain to the fullest, and he would not use anything to mitigate or deaden that pain. He wanted to go to the extreme end of suffering, so that he could redeem mankind with his precious sacrifice. He did this for the disciples who went to sleep on him, who abandoned him, denied him, and these are our spiritual predecessors. Why do I say spiritual predecessors? Because in them we see ourselves. Okay, they failed him, and in their failure they mirror our own failings towards him. How great love Jesus has shown. Okay, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and finally we see at the cross. In Gethsemane, so what was really happening? If we can summarize the suffering that Jesus was going on, why was this such an intense struggle? In Gethsemane, Jesus engaged spiritually the forsakenness on the cross. Remember, my God, why have you abandoned me? That cry which will be, given out from Golgotha, that is anticipated here in Gethsemane. Jesus had become the cup of wrath of God. So when he became sin, okay, God and sin cannot be together. So God turned away from him because for a moment, for Jesus to die on the cross and become the great Paschal Lamb, he had to take the sin of the entire world upon him. So in effect, he had to become the cup of the wrath of God. And when he became the cup of the wrath of God, he became sin from which God would turn away his face. And that is the reason here at Gethsemane and later on at the cross, okay, we find Jesus feeling an intense sense of abandonment given by his Father. He couldn't get any spiritual consolation. All that he could feel around him was only darkness and emptiness, like even God had abandoned him. But first, he would lose what was most precious to him. And what was here at Gethsemane that he lost was, and followed right up to the cross, the sense of his Father's precious presence. It was gone. That was the bedrock of his entire mission, his entire ministry. When he went from Galilee all over Judea proclaiming the good news, God, his Father, his Abba, was the bedrock on which he based himself. That was the deep intimacy he enjoyed with his Father. But today, when he's coming finally to the new Exodus, he has to become the cup of wrath of God, which is mentioned by Isaiah in chapter 51:17. The cup was filled with the wrath of God against sin in all its destructive and distorting power. Jesus knew he had to choose willingly to become a curse. So he had to become a curse. Somebody who dies on the cross was considered to be a curse among the Jews. He had to willingly agree to become a curse, to become sin. He became sin for us. That was his inner struggle. In the sorrowful intensity of this hour, not even Jesus' closest disciples could remain contented. Now, why Gethsemane? Gethsemane was an orchard of ancient olive trees. The fruit of these trees remain vital, okay, for an oil used in cooking, heating, lighting, and even healing. The very fact that Jesus is suffering, his entire agony is taking place here at Gethsemane. Okay, this whole drama is being played out over here is very, very ironic, because this is a place, okay, where the olives, okay, would be crushed and their oil removed. Finding an oasis of peace. This was a place where Jesus often came, amid the hustle and bustle of the city life. He would like to, withdraw and come here to find the comfort of, solitude here, to pray to his Father. So in going to Gethsemane to pray, Jesus sought a place where he had known solace before. And the name Gethsemane means, the name itself means olive press. In the midst of the orchard was a device used to squeeze the olives until they yielded the precious oil. So you see what is happening psychologically, what is happening to Jesus here. Calvary is already anticipated here psychologically and in the mind. He is being crushed with the weight of sin. Okay, it's like as if, like the oil press, he is like an olive and the oil press is, pressing on him, removing the last drop of oil from him. So as Jesus drew near to completing our salvation, Jesus the Messiah would himself have to be squeezed. Jesus had to enter the olive press where the weight of the world was upon him. Jesus would have to make a deliberate choice to move into the darkness, despair, and death of bearing the sin of the world upon himself. Remaining faithful to his mission, Jesus in Gethsemane accepted being pressed down unto death on the cross. His blood would be squeezed out of him in order to redeem us, just like the olives were pressed down to yield its precious oil, which was normally used. The first oil that was squeezed out was considered to be the purest one, and it was always used only in lighting the sanctuary lamps in the Jerusalem temple. The other, the second or the third round, whatever oil was removed, it would be used for other purposes. So here, where Jesus is on this night of his suffering and the place itself, there are striking parallels, bringing out, intensifying and actually highlighting the agony that he is undergoing. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say. They continued sleeping. And he came a third time, and okay, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough. The hour has come. Now Jesus is strengthened. Luke tells us that an angel comes and comforts him, but we do not know. Okay, Jesus comes around, he picks himself, gathers himself, and he is very resolute in seeing that he inaugurates the Exodus and takes it to the final culmination. The intensity of Jesus' inner struggle. Isaiah 53:12 describes the suffering Messiah in these words. He poured out his soul unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. What does it mean of numbered with the transgressors? He became a sinner, though he was the sinless one. He probably must have been the most, the most pristine soul ever in the world, and yet he had to bear the weight of mankind's sin upon him and become himself a transgressor. So this spiritual struggle on a psychological level was an essential part of his sacrifice. We can only imagine which psalms came to Jesus' mind as he sought words for his agony, as he was the righteous sufferer par excellence. Jesus often intensely quoted the Psalms, and so must have given vent to his great anguish by playing the Psalms even on this night. The comforting assurance of his Father's love in his heart, felt since youth, is being taken away. What is that psychological turmoil? Why is his suffering so very intense? What is Jesus really suffering here? He's suffering here because he doesn't feel the presence of his loving Father here. He felt like as if that entire love of his Father has been taken away. Jesus feels that he is becoming repugnant to his Father because his Father no longer can bear to look upon him because he's become the cup of wrath, the cup of sin from which God turns away his face. So such emptiness horrifies the solid sense of his Father's comforting arms around him, which he always felt all his life. He sees it now giving way to a dark abyss. Abyss is what something like a pit, okay, which is bottomless. So he can see that all that he can see is a dark abyss, and this makes him recoil in horror, staring at the emptiness and endless darkness engulfing him. And he knows very well this is not going to go away till he finally triumphs the cross. This pain and the desolation and the despair that he feels like even God has abandoned him, he has to face it. Like we have seen this in the lives of many of our great saints, especially Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. They describe this as a dark night of the soul. When even in prayer they found no consolation, they felt like as if God is not present at all. He's gone away, a feeling of complete desolation and dryness. This is exactly what Jesus must have felt, and much, much more than that. Any other human would have quit in this type of despair, but Jesus, on his knees and on his face, still speaks the cry of his soul directly, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." In other words, get me out of this, save me, don't leave me, do this another way. But he knows very well God's answer is no. Luke is the only evangelist among the synoptics who makes one very strange observation in his gospel. He mentions that about Jesus sweating drops of blood. Being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. This detail is not mentioned by any of the other evangelists, be it Mark, Matthew, or John. And only Luke mentions it. Probably he was a doctor, and we know that Luke had recourse to a lot of the stories from the Jerusalem community. So who knows? We do not really know. Somebody must have known about this, which was mistaught by the rest of the evangelist. And being a doctor, he is very sensitive to this, and he mentioned this in particular. So this couldn't possibly have been made up, because the suffering of Jesus was so very intense. What Luke is actually describing is a documented physical reaction to extreme stress, and science supports this. Okay, it is an encounter. Okay, it is a condition called hematohydrosis. What is hematome? Is anything to do with blood. Hydrosis is anything to do with water. So the simplest understanding is blood mixing with water, a rare but documented physical reaction to extreme stress, the bursting of the capillaries under the skin so that the blood comes through the pores. And this Luke tells us because it is very much believable. We know this must have happened, knowing the intensity of the agony that he went on the night that he was handed over to the Jewish authorities to be condemned. Jesus was in an extreme psychological contradiction. And what was that contradiction? He is holy. He is a holy soul, sinless, but he is being asked to become sin himself. The full extent of human sin. He is being asked to bear something which he is not. He was called upon to become sin. And this is the intense psychological contradiction that is going on in his soul. For us, it is very difficult to understand because we are so, leading our lives so often prone to sin. We have become very jaded. We are people who are compromised, so we don't have that sharp sensitivity, against sin. We don't have that, which Jesus must have had to a very high measure because he was a very sinless, pure soul. As Paul writes very beautifully, Paul summarizes for us. He made him to be sin. Who is he? God. God made him, Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And this is what, when Paul tells us this in his letter to the Corinthians, second letter, Paul is exactly able to, peep into the window of Jesus' heart and sense the intense psychological contradiction and struggle that is going on in his mind and heart and soul. Now, this very famous painting, The Agony of the Garden, by this Italian painter Giuseppe Cesari. Okay, you'll find in many of the museums all over the world. Okay, so coming here, we are coming to the end of our session. Just a sort of important detail that we would like to share. When we talk about the Garden of Gethsemane, today, if you happen to do a tour of the Holy Land, you're likely, going to go and visit the Garden of Gethsemane. But when we look at the Gospel accounts, be it Mark, Matthew or Luke, there is no mention of garden. It is simply they went to Gethsemane, not the Garden of Gethsemane. From where did this come about? It came about only after the 12th century because it was, like the accounts what were mentioned, especially in Mark and Matthew, were together conflated with the Gospel of John. Because in the Gospel of John, John also does not mention Gethsemane also, but he mentions they went to, locates the arrest of Jesus in a walled Kepos. He uses this word in Greek, which means, when translated, Kepos means a cultivated area, an enclosed sort of an orchard, okay? And when it is translated, the Greek word Gethsemane comes from Hebrew or very similar Aramaic word which is called Gethsemane, literally meaning a press of oils. And there is one particular archaeologist, she has proved very emphatically and very, the way she has come out with it, many of the scholars today are convinced that this is definitely not the site of the agony of Jesus on the night he was betrayed. It is another place. Gethsemane is a different place, a little away from the olive grove, which is very adjacent to the Church of All Nations. Okay, that archaeologist is Joan Taylor. She argues that the name better applies to a cave just north of the olive tree grove, close to it, but not here. To the north of the olive tree grove, excavations conducted in the cave in the 1950s uncovered evidence of an olive oil press. This cave, she suggests, once stood, in a closed enclosure, which possibly John calls it Kepos. And that is why these two accounts of Matthew and Mark, okay, calling, say, where they refer to the site as Gethsemane, and John's Gospel, where he refers to it as a walled Kepos, they came to be conflated, and that's how it came to be called the Garden of Gethsemane. But actually, Kepos doesn't translate exactly to a garden. It can be an enclosed, cultivated area, and this is the thing that they have. The cave of Gethsemane. This there they have found it is actually an olive press, and this is the way I put out this picture for you, showing a visual illustration as to how the olives would be crushed and the oil would be extracted. These are the baskets of olive. Okay, they would be kept over here, and that's a huge beam press which would be used to crush, and this was a stone, and this would be the something that keeps popping up over here. I'm not able to point out. So here down here you have a sort of a vat that gathers the oil, and it is then taken to the rest of the holders or containers. So probably this is not the site, but this definitely is the site. I put out pictures over here. This is the interior of the cave of Gethsemane, which is very close to that orchard, olive orchard, okay, that olive grove that is there. And this is in the custody of the Franciscan friars who are in charge of many places in the Holy Land. So when you take the tourist, it's very strange. People don't want to go and visit this cave of Gethsemane because that doesn't look to be very appealing and exciting for them. Rather, they would prefer to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, which for all practical purposes is not the authentic site where Jesus suffered. These are the pictures I've put out here, the plan of the entire cave of Gethsemane here, because it is very much believable, because this must have been a place where Jesus would go and rest for the night along with his disciples whenever he was there in Jerusalem. So probably this must have been a place where they frequently put out, and probably also the reason why we will see Judas comes, okay, bringing the entire cohort of the temple guards here to this place, because probably they might have not known where Jesus would be putting out. So for all practical purposes, it would be like a small little hideout where Jesus was used to sleeping at nights along with his disciples. This is part of the picture over there of that same cave of Gethsemane. The sanctuary in the easternmost extension of the cave, this is supposed to be the place where the olive press may have been located here. So here, this is a holy place, sort of, people go and visit. Some of them, not everyone. Chairs and all are kept here. Wherever people go over there are masses and all celebrated. So this is probably, looks to be 90%, it definitely could be the site where Jesus actually suffered on the night, okay, he was taken in. I would like to end here with, this is Monsignor Raniero Cantalamessa. I don't know if you've ever heard, he was a former chaplain of the Vatican during Pope Francis's time. During COVID time, he was very famous giving out very beautiful sermons during the online masses that were celebrated at the Vatican. He considers Gethsemane to reveal the interior aspect of Jesus' passion, the depth of the heart. It is like, we said that Calvary was anticipated here at Gethsemane, but he puts it out very tellingly, the depth of the heart. It is like as if Jesus' heart had stopped here, okay? He had literally died a psychological death, a spiritual death, which precedes and gives meaning to the death of the body, which would finally occur at the cross. Gethsemane signals the deepest depression in the passing of Jesus from this world to the Father. We will all agree, because the depths of the pain and the agony that he underwent here at Gethsemane, it must have been very unbearable. I'm sure no human being would ever be able to go through it and yet survive. But Jesus did emerge from it and finally went to his cross on Calvary. What kind of sadness was that? Perhaps for Jesus, it felt like this, to be pressed down with grief like an olive under a millstone, to have the weight of the world on his back, knowing he will be crushed by it. He also must have experienced a lot of fear. And what was the fear? to fear, despite earlier predictions otherwise, that he will never get up again. This fear must have been very palpable. As a human being, he was vulnerable. He could have, backed out from the entire plan of his father, knowing the horrors that he would be going on. So that fear also must have been very, very real for him, that he will never get up again. And knowing that if he does not rise, neither will the world rise, because had Jesus to fall at Gethsemane and turned his back on God's plan, I don't think we would have been here also doing this lesson today. All will have been in vain. All would be lost. All he wanted, all he prayed for, worked for, yearned for, everything, the 3 years of mission that he put in, the tremendous amount of effort that he put in proclaiming the good news and proclaiming the inauguration of God's kingdom, all that would have come to waste. It would have been a lesson in futility. All the power he expended to heal will be for nothing. All this world that he tasted with such joy will become ashes in his mouth. Everyone and everything he loves will be lost forever. So this is the kind of sadness that engulfed his heart and mind and brought such a lot of pressure on that night when he found himself all alone, deprived even so much so as just companionship of his closest disciples. That was the ultimate price he willingly agreed to pay when he bowed his head and submitted to the will of his beloved Father, saying, "Not my will, but your will be done, Abba, Father." Think about this. Calvary would not have been possible without the anguished pain and agony of Gethsemane, the place of grinding and squeezing to the last drop. And that is why the very fact that he suffered at this particular site of Gethsemane, where there was this olive press, where oil used to be, squeezed out to the last drop, it brings out the agony of Jesus in a very spectacular light, and really takes us into the very heart of Jesus on that night when he was suffering. Okay, and I'm sure it is a very consoling thought to bear in mind that when he prayed for the whole world and took the sin of the world upon himself, he must have remembered you and me and did it for us. For that, we have to be eternally grateful to him and the Heavenly Father itself. So that is the end of our session for today. Okay, session 36. Any questions?